Thank you, Rachel. I'm really looking forward to the discussion this evening, but as an oil guy, I feel an obligation to set the tone for tonight's discussion, so you have to bear with me for one moment. There you go. Let's go Hawks! All right. As we get into this, I wanted to provide some introductory remarks to set the stage for this evening. And although the lecture is titled The Shale Gas Revolution and American Competitiveness, I'd like to change this to be more around source rock resources. And the reason is for two reasons. The first one is the technology for developing shale gas, horizontal drilling coupled with multi-stage hydraulic fracturing is the same technology that you use to develop shale oil. And so they both come from source rock resources, and we think that makes sense. The second thing is that there's several interesting dynamics that exist between oil markets, gas markets, and the natural gas liquids. And they all tie together. So therefore, let's think about this in terms of a broader look, which is the source rock resources perspective. With that, I want to set the stage with a bit of history, followed by some comments on the resource scale. So from a history perspective, although most folks don't know this, the history of the shale revolution is almost as old as the oil industry is itself. Shales have long been known as source rocks, and they are the source for traditional or conventional oil reservoirs. They just don't flow very well. So fundamentally, when you think about source rock resources and traditional resources, think about beach sand and concrete. All right, so a conventional reservoir flows like water through the beach, and an unconventional or source rock resource or shale resource is like trying to get oil out of your cement in your driveway. By combining two technologies, the horizontal drilling and the multi-stage hydraulic fracturing, oil companies are able to access more rock, and they can flow it at commercial rates. Now, the history goes back to Colonel Drake. He drilled the first oil well in 1859, and the first planned directional wells were bottomed in the early 1920s. The first horizontal well was drilled in 1929, and it was primarily an experiment that didn't lead to much of anything. Directional drilling really started taking off in the 1970s as the U.S. started stepping offshore and trying to be more cost efficient, drilling from platforms and locations and reach far reservoirs. So we learned how to drill wells in different directions. And that then led to horizontal drilling, with the major advent occurring in central Louisiana, eastern Texas, with the development of the Austin Chalk, a tight conventional reservoir. I had the good fortune to drill in one of the early short radius wells in West Cote Blanche Bay in the Bay Fields of Louisiana early in my career. So horizontal drilling has been with us some time. Now, on the hydraulic fracturing side, a gone but not forgotten Chicago oil company called Amoco were the first to fracture a well, and they did that in 1947 in Kansas. Wow. And since that time, over 1 million wells have been fractured in North America. Very, very few of those have ever recorded an incident of contamination or water issues. So it's a proven technology, fracturing. With the combination of the horizontal drilling and the fracturing, this was brought together by some guys out of Dallas, Mitchell Energy. George Mitchell in particular was looking for a way to develop some resources in and around his acreage near Dallas, and combined horizontal drilling with hydraulic fracturing in the Barnett Shale with success. And since that time, it's just taken off. We've seen this technology being applied to many shale basins, the Marcellus, the Utica, the Bakken, the list goes on. Now, how big is this resource is a question that comes up from many audiences. And I want to share with you some official numbers from the Energy Information Agency and then provide what we hear from industry insiders with some facts and context to set things for us today. So the latest 2013 estimates that the EI comes up with shale gas put the resource, technically recoverable resource, at 6.4 quadrillion standard cubic feet. So what does that mean? Well, 6.4 quads is roughly 1 trillion barrels of oil. Okay, so, okay, that's a lot. How much is 1 trillion barrels of oil? Well, it's roughly all the oil that we've consumed and produced today. All right, so it puts it on a scale. Another scale factor to think about is the largest oil reservoir that we know of is the Ghawar field in Saudi Arabia. The technically recoverable resources on shale gas are roughly 2 to 2.5 Ghawars. So this is a large thing. On top of that, we see light tight oil, and the estimates from the EIA on light tight oil, or shale oil, is around 50, 75 to 100 billion barrels. Now, their estimates are very, very new, and what we've seen is that the EIA makes these early estimates, and then early on in a resource development, those estimates increase with time. An example of that would be the estimates they had around the recoverable oil in the Bakken. So in 1995, they said 151 million barrels of oil existed in the Bakken. In 2008, they upped that number to 4 billion. In 2013, they've increased it to 12 billion. And if you talk to the players in that basin, they estimate the resource 24 billion plus. And that's on the scale of Prudhoe Bay or the pre-salt Tupi finds that we've recently seen in Brazil. So all in all, it looks like the resource is fairly large. Now at A.T. Kearney, we've created a proprietary source rock physical flow and economic model where we take a look at the economics in the basin, we carry it through to the entire value chain from exploration production through the midstream on into the consuming sectors such as chemicals, power generation, steel making. And as we look at this, we believe the resource is very, very large. It's game-changing. And although it is currently being developed in North America, we see a lot of potential internationally for this resource. So with that, I'd like to take a little time and introduce our panelists and step into their comments. So on my left, we have Brian Ames. Brian is the business president of Olefins, Aromatics, and Alternatives for Dow Chemical Company. And he's responsible for providing a growing source of low-cost monomers to Dow's downstream businesses. The responsibility includes asset management of Dow's position as the world's largest producer of ethylene and production of the related monomers and development of new technologies for these monomers and the purchases and sales of products to balance Dow's needs. So he's got a very, very important front-end role in the Dow value chain. He's spent over 30 years with Dow, working across areas such as commercial finance, global marketing, investor relations. He served in Houston as a leader of their global business director for their polyethylene business, and also as a global business director in the Aromatics and Olefins business in Switzerland, so an international person. Brian has a Bachelor of Science degree in chemical engineering from Queen's University, and he really gets my hockey comments, so I'm appreciative for that. To his left, we have Marianne Ka. Marianne's chief economist for ConocoPhillips and is responsible for developing the company's market outlooks for oil, natural gas, refining, and marketing, as well as the regional and special strategic studies. She's the company's expert in scenario planning based in Houston. Prior to Conoco, she spent time with Cabot Corporation, which was a chemical company, and she's been a planner with the U.S. Synthetic Fuels Corporation and served with the Energy and Minerals Division of the U.S. General Accounting Office. She's also served as the president of the United States Association for Energy Economics, where she received a Senior Fellow Award for that organization. And she served as the chairman of the Committee on Economics and Statistics at the American Petroleum Institute. Marianne has a Bachelor of Science degree from Cornell and a Master of Public Administration from the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. To her left, we have Andy Swaminathan, not Swaminathan, as I was told earlier. Andy's the Senior Vice President of Portfolio Strategy with Constellation. He currently leads the Portfolio Strategy Group responsible for portfolio management, market fundamentals, transmission, pricing, quantitative analysis, strategic systems, and business operations. He has 24 years in the power industry and Of that, about 15 with the Exelon companies. Prior to Exelon, he was with New York Power Authority and serving in roles in transmission planning, rates, regulation, wholesale marketing, and trading. Andy has a Bachelor of Science degree in electrical engineering from the College of Engineering in Madras, India, a Master's in electrical engineering from New Jersey Institute of Technology, and an MBA from Pace University in New York. So thank you. Okay, with that, I'll hand it to Brian for your comments.
Good. Well, thanks a lot, Vance, and it's great to be here in Chicago. It's the new hockey town here in Chicago, I guess. But I flew over from Michigan, and their guys in Detroit are still licking their wounds from what's gone on this year. As business president of Olefins and Aromatics at Dow, my primary job, as Vance mentioned, is to supply low-cost monomers to the downstream businesses in Dow. And basically, 90% of everything that we produce in the company comes from ethylene and propylene. And these are the low-cost building block monomers that we have for everything else in the company. And basically, it's the front end of Dow. We have operations all around the world. We're always looking for low-cost sources of raw materials to produce these monomers. And my job is to look all around the world to figure out how we can get a cost-advantage source of these monomers so that Dow can be competitive. It's critically important for our company. Today I'd like to talk about three key areas. One is that the shale gas phenomenon here is real, and Vance mentioned a whole bunch of details there, but this is creating an energy advantage here in this country that's very different from what we've seen in the last decade. Secondly, it's leading to a U.S. manufacturing renaissance here, which is dramatically different from what we've seen in the last decade. And lastly, there's a balanced situation between supply and demand that's important that we need to really be cognizant of. It can be fragile. It has been in past years, and we need to keep an eye on not just the supply side, but also the domestic demand side and see how it grows so that we don't create an imbalance that takes away an opportunity for this country. To get into it a little bit more, when we look at the shale gas dynamics, the producers of oil and gas in this country, they're heroes to all of us. They've figured out how to pull gas from the ground and bring it to the surface in a competitive way so that we can have an energy advantage in this country. And it's real. The resources now that people talk about is an energy advantage that could last for 100 years. And so this is a long-term opportunity for this country that is yet to be developed. And when I think of the demand side, there are a number of different areas where the demand is really picking up. And what we have to do, though, is there's a lot of attention that's gone toward the supply side, but the demand side is just getting going, really. Dow has been involved in manufacturing all over the world, and we started here in this country, and it spent a lot of money in the 50s and 60s building plants here. But then we started going into other parts of the world because we could find cheaper raw materials. And basically what we're seeing today is an opportunity to come back home. We're building new plants in the U.S. Gulf for ethylene and propylene. It's a significant investment. We'll create about 4,800 jobs with these investments, and actually about 35,000 indirect jobs that go with that. And basically, this is leading to maybe a proxy for the U.S. manufacturing industry, where when we look at what's going on across the U.S. manufacturing base, we've decided to catalog a list of projects that we're seeing. And basically, we now have 123 different projects that are going forward in the U.S. because of the energy advantage here. It's more than $100 billion of investments. And when we add up all the jobs that get created from this manufacturing renaissance, we think it's around 5 million new jobs that are being created. This is very significant, and especially when you compare it to what's happened in the last decade. There was 42,000 U.S. plants that were shut down. About 6 million jobs were lost because of the competitiveness here. And what we're seeing now is a change in that whole dynamic. Instead of the U.S. manufacturing being a bit of a drag on the U.S. economy, what we're seeing it is actually as a stimulant for the growth here. So this is phenomenal. It's very good for all of us. and it's still being developed. This list of 123 different companies, we get more projects added to the list almost every week. So we don't even really know yet how good that demand is really going to be. And if we turn to the balance side, this is the part that you've probably seen a lot about Dow in the press, because we've been quite vocal about just understanding the demand side better. And basically, there's a lot of work that's gone on to develop the supply side understanding. You heard a lot about it for resources and so on. And now that the supply side is really proving itself, it's allowing the industries that consume gas to make investment decisions. And that process is evolving. But this balance between supply and demand can be fragile in this industry. We've seen it before where the demand didn't come as well, or sorry, the supply didn't come as well as we thought it would, and then the demand was already stimulated, and prices of gas went up and became extremely volatile, and it became a problem for the manufacturers in this country. So why not take a little bit of time to really study the demand side a little bit more? It is evolving. Understand it both not just from a manufacturing perspective, but also from traditional uses in the power sector and so on, and then feather in exports too. I mean, Dow is not against LNG exports, but we do think that we should be careful with short-sighted policies because this is a long-term opportunity. And so what we want to do is make sure that we get the opportunity to really study the demand side, understand the impact that has on supply, and see if this can be an opportunity that can really last. So when we look at it, it's a big opportunity for all of us. It's really kind of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and I think we all have a lot to look forward to here.
Thank you, Brian. Marianne?
Yes. What I wanted to talk about is the benefits of the shale revolution from my perspective as an oil and gas producer, and also some of the policy issues that I think need to be set correctly in order to maintain the shale revolution. So starting with the benefits, you've heard about the benefits to manufacturers. Some of the developments we're seeing today have already created 1.8 million jobs in the United States. And our industry, the U.S. oil and gas industry, has 9.6 million jobs, both directly and indirectly. And another million jobs could be added because of this shale phenomenon by 2020. The industry is contributing over $1 trillion to gross domestic product and billions in government revenue through taxes, royalties, and lease bonuses. So at the time of this high deficit, there's a lot of benefits to be had from the shale revolution. The U.S. has gained a serious competitive advantage, as my colleague from Dow just mentioned, having affordable natural gas. Energy-intensive manufacturers are building new factories. It's not just ethylene. It's fertilizer, steel, aluminum, forest products. I could go on and on. In the state of Illinois, the oil and gas industry supports 270,000 jobs and contributes $34 billion to the state's economy. And let me give you a concrete example of our company in our spending in the state of Illinois. We spent $30 million last year on IT services in Illinois, and then spent millions more on such items as environmental services, pumps and seals, telecommunications equipment, specialty chemicals, and transmitters. So just spending in the oil and gas industry actually has a large multiplier throughout the country, is the point I'm trying to make. Meanwhile, consumers are seeing lower bills for home heating and lower bills from electricity. In fact, the electricity point is very important because that also supports our businesses by having lower cost electricity. From energy security point of view, the U.S. now does not need to import LNG. In fact, could become an LNG exporter by 2016. Also, if you look at North America as a whole, combining the U.S. and Canada, by 2020, given the shale, the tight oil, or shale as we call it, as well as the Canadian oil sands and Gulf of Mexico deep water, you put all that together, and North America could be a crude exporter by 2020. So this is a huge change. It has a big significance for energy security, shorter supply chain, more diverse supplies, Supplies closer to market, so hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico won't be as big a problem for the United States energy supply. It also could ease pressure on world energy markets and prices. And our stronger position in the U.S. reduces the leverage of exporting countries whose interests may differ from ours, so huge geopolitical benefits as well. And then there are the environmental benefits, particularly from using natural gas in the power sector. There's little production of nitrogen and sulfur oxides, mercury, particulates, and only half as much carbon dioxide as, say, a coal-fired power plant. So big benefits. In fact, as a result, U.S. Greenhouse gas emissions in the energy sector have now dropped to the early 1990s levels just in the last few years, which is incredible. If you think about it, our power generation has gone up by more than 20%, but our greenhouse gas emissions have dropped 1% during that entire time period. And it's all because of coal to gas fuel switching, which has occurred because of much lower natural gas prices, not because of any government policy. So let me stop there on the benefits and talk about what policies or what concerns I have. What do I worry about in terms of what's going to keep this revolution going? The first thing is, every time we turn around, the federal government wants to target the oil and gas industry for higher taxes. And I think there's some misperceptions about our industry. People look at our earnings and they think, wow, we're very profitable. But the earnings are more reflective of the scale of our business. And offshore development costs billions of dollars, for example. So obviously our earnings have to be in the billions or we can't afford to make the investments that are required in our business. So if you take scale into account, our profitability is 6 cents per dollar of sales versus the general manufacturing sector average of 8 cents. So it's not abnormally profitable. In fact, it's probably under average. Our effective global tax rate last year was 51.5%. So our industry clearly does pay its fair share of taxes. And people don't realize that higher taxes reduces our ability to invest in new production. We're losing 10% a year on average of existing production, and therefore have to replace that before we could even talk about growing. So we need to invest constantly. Also, we can't compete overseas with national oil companies and our overseas compatriots and colleagues if we are paying higher taxes. Another issue is we need to be allowed to access markets, or otherwise we can't sustain production. Part of that is it's very difficult to get permits for pipelines to deliver oil and gas to markets today. That's an issue, and I'm sure we're going to talk about Keystone later, but that's probably the biggest, most glaring example of it. Exports. Exports improve the balance of trade and create jobs and income here. We also could help reduce greenhouse gas emissions internationally if we exported gas to countries, developing countries in particular, that otherwise might be using coal. And I think we're going to have to export crude simply because all of these shale liquids are very, very light oil. Because heavier oil, you can't, these are impermeable fields, and the smaller the molecule, the easier it is to bring it to the wellbore. So we're producing very light oils, which really does not match the refining system of the United States. It matches other systems much better. So what we really need to do is import heavy oil, which does match our refining system, and export light oil. So I think you're going to be hearing a lot more about crude exports going forward. Another policy issue that we're concerned about is killing the shale revolution with overregulation. Regulations are obviously necessary and important, but they should be smart and cost-effective and based on science. Millions of wells have been safely fractured since the 1940s, as Vance has told us. And under existing numerous federal, state, and local regulations, this is a very heavily regulated industry to begin with. And so what we don't want is duplicate regulations that add cost but don't have any environmental benefits, or a one-size-fits-all federal approach that wouldn't work in all geological environments. We also need to have reasonable permitting. It takes way too long to get permits to develop resources and to build infrastructure. And groundless claims are allowed to create legal roadblocks. Greater resource access. The shale revolution, not surprisingly, has really occurred on private land. The government can make more resources available to continue the revolution. And finally, we're worried that there isn't a level playing field for energy sources. We don't think the government should pick winners and losers in terms of fuel source. Performance standards, yes, but they should let the markets and, for example, utilities figure out what the best way to meet whatever the performance targets are. And finally, we should truly have an above all of the above energy policy as opposed to picking winners. So I'm sure that's creating a lot of controversy, and I'll get lots of questions, but those are the things that we worry about. And thank you. Oh, and by the way, the only hockey I get to see is in the ice rink at the Galleria shopping mall, I'm afraid.
Thanks, Marianne. Andy?
Great. Good evening. I'd like to thank the Chicago Council of Global Affairs for inviting Exelon and me personally to this wonderful event this evening. It is indeed an honor to be here. For my opening remarks, I thought I'll take a few minutes to give you a real brief overview of Exelon. I'm sure all of you are familiar with ComEd, your friendly local utility company, but I wasn't sure how many of you knew about Exelon, which is really the parent company and a really large organization. So I thought I'll spend some time talking about Exelon, which will help frame my perspective to this topic. And then I'll spend a few minutes on this overall issue of shale gas and how it impacts the electric power generation side of the business. So Exelon is one of the nation's largest competitive integrated energy companies. Our business includes Exelon Generation, the nation's #1 competitive generator, and Constellation, the part of the company that I work for, is the nation's largest competitive retail and wholesale energy supplier. Our generation portfolio has approximately 35,000 megawatts of generation, 55% of which is baseload nuclear generation, 28% uses natural gas, and about 10% is hydroelectric and renewables, and the remaining small portion is pieces of coal and oil generation. Exelon's regulated utilities, ComEd in Illinois, PECO in Pennsylvania, and BG&E in Maryland, collectively serve around 7 million customers and centered around 3 metropolitan areas of Chicago, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, respectively. Collectively, all the companies together, we have a large national presence. We operate in 47 states, the District of Columbia, and in Canada. We have a unique combination of scale and scope across the energy value chain that spans from upstream oil and gas exploration, obviously very, very small compared to my colleague to my right, to conventional generation, renewable generation, regulated utilities, wholesale and retail markets, which also include beyond-the-meter product offerings. The scale and scope allows us to participate in both regulated and deregulated markets and create value opportunities for our customers and for our shareholders. Exelon's platform has always been to stand for competitive markets, both for power and gas, and we believe it leads to a better outcome for both producers and customers. I won't elaborate on that concept, and I'm sure we'll get into that as we go through our panel discussions, and that'll form the basis of many of my responses to, I'm sure, some of the questions that'll come along. On the topic of shale gas and natural gas as a whole, it is extremely important to our business, especially as it pertains to the unregulated Exelon Generation and Constellation business. In most of the markets that we operate our generation, natural gas has increasingly become the marginal fuel for a large portion of the year, and hence is the key driver for the price of electricity, and ultimately has a big influence on the overall profitability of the company. Given the potential of a plentiful natural resource base, as Vance elaborated on, and the prospects of stable costs for natural gas and its cleaner carbon attributes compared to coal, it has become the preferred fuel of new conventional generation being built across the country. This, along with other concurrent changes, such as increased renewable generation and impending coal retirements caused by new environmental rules, and frankly, the economic pressures of low natural gas prices, will change the generation stack quite a bit even compared to what was 5 to 10 years ago, was the mix of generation in the US. Needless to say, it promises to be a dynamic, interesting, and challenging time for the power generation industry. I'll conclude with that, and I pass it back to Vance.
Okay, thank you. It sounds as if all three of you agree that the resource is real and of scale. I'm taking that away from the conversation. Given that, and given the importance of the front-end exploration and development and the cycle times it takes to drill for shale oil or shale gas, and the cycle times relative to the investments, particularly in your business, Brian, or in your business, Andy, Marianne, in your business, as you think about the downstream sectors, potentially LNG export or even refining, talk about how that impacts your business, those cycle time differences and phase differences and investment horizons, and how that affects you, how you think about your investments and taking advantage of this resource. I'll start with you, Brian.
Well, I would say that this is exactly the risk that we have to think through is how solid is the supply, and will it last for long enough until we get our plants up and running? We have a series of investments in the U.S. Gulf, but the biggest one is building this new ethylene cracker, which involves a large amount of ethylene production that is growth, and then also derivative assets that go with it. And as a result of that, we won't get it all up and running until 2017. And a lot of the effort that we had to try and get these projects approved is to prove to our board and our management that actually this supply was real and it could last that long. And then actually have it available once we're up and running for a period of time so that we can get the payback from the investment. And so we've had to spend a lot of time understanding the supply, ensuring that it's really real, and then working hard to ensure that it stays in place for long enough for this investment to really take place. And this is the comment about the short-sighted policies when this is a long-term opportunity. And we're not the only ones with this issue. The whole manufacturing industry has the same problem. But, but basically what we're seeing is that today there is an excess of supply of gas because we need the producers to prove that the gas is available, and that's what's gone on here. Today, now we know the gas is available, so companies like ours are making the investments to use the gas. But it's going to take a period of about 5 years before the demand can really respond to the supply initiative. And so we're going through this period of the next 5 years where actually gas supply is long. And gas producers need to develop that opportunity for the demand. And so you're seeing a full-fledged effort across the industry to develop demand in whatever application they can develop. And so this is where we've been trying to bring the people's attention to the demand side that's coming. And it's really only just evolving. It's something that's being generated, and we're getting there. So that's exactly right up the alley that we've been thinking about.
Okay. Andy, in your sector, there's a substantial amount of baseload generation that comes from coal and from nuclear. And if you look at the age of that infrastructure, particularly on the coal side, many of those plants are 50 years old and 60 years old. Yes, they've had capital upgrades, but as we look at it, it looks like there's going to be required capital infusion, regulations that drive capital investment on the environmental side. How do you weigh those investments, that time horizon, and the potential for using natural gas as baseload generation?
Right. I think that's a great question, and actually it's very, very topical. I'm not sure if some of you caught this. We just announced, I believe it was yesterday, and I have someone from my IR team here who can correct me and keep me honest here. It was just, I think yesterday, we announced the cancellation of 2 nuclear uprates. So you talk about baseload nuclear generation. And it goes back to my opening remarks, which is even 5 to 10 years ago, this would have been unthinkable. Right. And I'll just give you a couple of data points here in terms of the pricing of natural gas, which kind of influenced some of our own thinking as we were looking forward to make some investments. So quick history lesson. Let's run back to 07, 08. And we all remember the event in Louisiana of Hurricane Katrina in 2005, which led to this phenomenal gas spike. But fundamentally, we were looking at a looming shortage for natural gas, and obviously gas being linked to the price of oil. Natural gas in the US, call it even in 2007, 2008, was trading at $13 an MMBTU on a prompt month basis. And forgive me if I use some industry jargon here, just stop me. So that was a forward month basis, was trading at $13 an MMBTU. And 2 years forward, so back in 2007, we as Exelon, looking forward at our investment cycle, we were looking at gas at, call it approximately $10 an MMBTU. At $10 an MMBTU, and remember, we were also talking about a carbon cap and trade program, which was being, was running through the halls of Congress at that point. So couple $10 natural gas prices, carbon cap and trade, be it a tax form or whatever, and we were talking, the old Waxman-Markey bill was looking at $10 to $15 a ton of carbon. Nuclear generation was looking phenomenal. Exelon's stock price was $90. Fortunately, it's about a third of that today. It's directly related to the fact that gas has gone from $10 and $12 an MMBTU to approximately $4 to $5 an MMBTU in the visible trading horizon. So what that really means from an investment cycle is nuclear generation, which is at the base load component, the cheapest megawatt, definitely on a variable cost, but very, very high capital intensive projects are essentially not looking economic. We spent an enormous amount of time even thinking about building a nuclear plant in the Texas marketplace, and we went really far along. We absolutely had to shelve that too. So we completely abandoned new nuclear generation in the merchant generation perspective. And we said, you know what, we'll go to uprates. And why uprates work is this is on existing nuclear generation. Obviously, there's no new O&M involved. You're just kind of building on essentially, say, a 1,000 megawatt baseload nuclear plant and making it a 1,100 megawatt plant or something like that. And we've done a lot of that. Actually, the last 10 years, we've built the size of a nuclear plant by just doing minimal uprates over our existing 20 facilities. But at this point, even those look very challenging. So to finish up with my opening remarks and kind of tie that together is the generation stack is changing a lot. Obviously, I think natural gas will be the new preferred conventional source of generation going forward. The good thing about that is the cycle times are pretty quick. So that's the favorable component. Think about a nuclear plant. Just by the time you get your permits, you get the NRC to approve anything, you've spent 5 to 10 years before you can even think about doing anything. Gas plants, you're talking your lead time is approximately 2 to 3 years, and then it takes about 18 months after that. So it's a pretty quick turnaround from the time of concept to actual physical megawatts hitting the grid. So in that sense, we are very, very encouraged by what shale gas has brought to the industry.
Okay, thank you, Andy. Marianne, that high gas price drove a great deal of drilling particularly the gas plays, the dry gas plays, and led to an oversupplied situation in your business. Can you talk about how you're thinking with regard to shifting investments and how quickly you can make those investments and turn rigs on and turn them off around gas and that transition between gas and oil drilling?
Right. Well, I mean, it's also a timing issue related to the other side, and that is we have not enough demand to absorb all of the gas supply that's being produced. So what's happened is in the last 2 years, the gas-directed rig count has fallen from like 1,600 to 400 something. I mean, so and it happened very quickly, and those rigs have been moved to drill for oil. The problem is, even though they're drilling for oil, they're throwing off a lot of associated gas, or they're drilling what we call wet gas, or gas that has liquids in it, which improve the economics. So at very low gas prices, like $3.50, even $3 or $2.50, you're continuing to produce because the economics, given that you have liquids in the play, or the gas is just free because it's an oil play throwing off gas, production isn't declining, despite the fact that we've had that huge reduction in rig count. So that should give you some comfort. If we get serious about drilling for dry gas, just imagine what production is going to do if we're trying not to drill for gas now, and production won't decline.
Right. Okay, thanks for that. I want to shift.
Oh, can I make one other point? I think even if gas prices were to go up to $5 or $6, and the MIT gas study said that 2/3 of our shale resources are economic at a price of $6 or below. But think about $6 per million BTU. That's the equivalent of $36 a barrel for oil. The rest of the world uses, particularly in the petrochemical sector, uses either naphtha, an oil-based feedstock, or their natural gas prices are tied to oil prices. So they're spending $100 a barrel for their feedstock, and even at $6, you're only spending $36. So I still think that we have a huge competitive advantage in our manufacturing sector.
Yeah. That's a great segue into the next line of questioning, which is around the international implications of this resource. We talked a bit about, potentially exporting LNG, reaching a point where we could actually export oil again, which is, almost unthinkable for, in my experience. And if we start doing that, and Brian, as you think about, gas-based chemicals manufacturing and the advantage it has relative to the naphtha oil base, that's a 6 to 10-fold cost advantage depending on what's going on there. Your products are going to go to markets, it's going to displace naphtha-based, which means I think ultimately you end up competing with low-cost African and Middle Eastern petrochemicals. And there's going to be a big market play with regard to where you're going to place those products from an export point of view. The same thing on the LNG and on the oil side. Talk a little bit about how you see the competitive dynamics changing and what might be some of the risks that you see with regard to international and governmental response to those changing economic flows.
Yeah, well, and I agree. The dynamics here have changed, and they've changed very quickly, and it's causing the world to sit up and listen to what we're doing here in the United States. And it's actually very dramatic. We even have companies in the Middle East suggesting that they need to pay more attention to what's going on in the United States. So this is all good. The big question for us is, how long does it last for? But a lot of the discussion so far is about today's types of prices, which is nothing short of remarkable compared to what we thought only a few years ago. But for Dow, what we do is we look all around the world for the lowest cost sources of raw materials, and we take kind of an understanding of what could be available, and then we make choices on where we think we should be investing. And we've looked long enough now around the world that we've come back to the U.S. because of this outlook, and the outlook is good. And so that's why we're coming here. It probably does cause us to spend less time looking for opportunities in other locations, and I think other countries will have to react to that. I don't know what they can do. I mean, obviously, there's many countries around the world today trying to figure out how to replicate what's happened here with shale gas, and that could occur, but we think it takes time, and quite a bit of time, for them to replicate what's gone on here in the United States.
Okay, Marianne?
Yeah, I would agree with that last statement you made. I mean, we're certainly trying to develop shale in China and in Poland. And the U.S. had the best combination of circumstances. We had private mineral rights, which is unique to the United States. And if you're going to deal with noise and trucks and drilling on your property, if you're not getting any economic benefits from it, you're not going to be in favor of it. Whereas here, people actually get the direct economic benefits. So that's the single biggest difference to me of why it happened first in the U.S. We also have a regulatory framework. We're looking in countries that don't have a regulatory framework. We also have a huge pipeline network because this is the source rock for production that we, conventional production that we used to have. So we already have the pipeline network. It wasn't running full. And we have open access to pipelines, whereas in other countries, the national oil company may control it. So there may not be an economic incentive if somebody's going to capture all your rent and take it in the transit fee. We also have a well-developed service industry. Europe, for example, only has a handful of land rigs. So there's all of these reasons why it will happen a lot slower. There's even questions about the geology. The U.S. seems to have very good geologic conditions, so the hydrocarbons are still around the source rock. They haven't escaped, and our shale source rock is very brittle. So it fractures very well, and we have very high productivity. It's not even clear whether you're going to get the same high productivity and therefore low cost in the rest of the world. So yes, I think it will happen in the rest of the world. It will just be happen more slowly, and it may be more expensive. But on that interesting note, Saudi Arabia is drilling 7 shale gas wells in the next year. So after grumbling about this phenomenon, they finally decided to see what it's all about. And Russia, who's not an OPEC member, but the second largest oil producer in the world, is now, the Rosneft, one of their national oil companies, is developing the Bazhenov, which may be the biggest shale liquids field in the world. Wow. The source rock to Western Siberia oil.
Okay. Andy, as you think about the power industry and natural gas displacing, coal-fired generation, coal companies will still be looking to make business. Do you envision any export of coal, and what would be the implications globally on that?
No, in fact, and that's a good point, and I probably forgot to mention this in the earlier question too. So we talked about coal retirements and changing the generation stack, and clearly there has been a huge substitution from nat gas to coal, and that definitely contributes to the power demand and the gas demand side of the equation. But having said that, my comment on coal would be we have approximately 300 gigawatts of coal in the US from a generation capability perspective, of which, per some of the analysis we've done and a lot of the analysis out there, we think somewhere between 40 and 50 gigawatts of coal will retire and some of that has already begun. We had approximately 10 gigawatts of coal exit the stack in 2012. So between now and 2016, and that's where some of the big environmental rules called the mercury and air toxics rules kick in the first quarter of 2015. So between 2012 and 2016, we think anywhere between 40 and 50 gigawatts of coal retire, which means coal continues to be a very important part of the generation stack. So I don't want to underplay that. So what is happening, and Vance, I think you alluded to that, the coal which is really exiting the stack is your dirty, unscrubbed, close to end of life, and probably small coal units, which are probably in the less than 300 megawatts of size. So your big coal plants, which are scrubbed, will survive and will remain a very important piece of the generation stack. Specific to your question on coal exports, definitely. In fact, last year we saw a very large increase in coal exports, given the fact that spot prices of gas dropped actually under $2 an MMBTU, which was in the heels of one of the warmest winters in the US last year, if you remember that. So given the general lack of storage for natural gas, prices is your only reaction to that excess gas. So gas prices had to drop to $2 to incent a huge amount of coal to gas switching. Essentially, coal inventories were piling up, and exports were actually a pretty valuable outlet for Northern Appalachian coal to Europe. Now, some of that has started peeling back again, and that's a function of the European economy more than anything else. But once Europe gets back on its feet, we think NAP coal, Northern Appalachian coal, will continue to be exported to Europe and also to Asia.
Okay, thank you for that. This will be the last set of questions before we hand to the audience. So there's a lot of debate in the press and in the broader community, business community, social, governmental community around the safety of fracturing, around water usage, around potential potable, drinkable water contamination, around the chemicals that are used in the fracturing process. Please comment on what your belief on that is and how much of that is real and how much of it is just fear because the industry hasn't communicated properly those kinds of topics. So, Marianne, I'm going to let you lead on that one.
Well, there's been several studies by the EPA and the Oil and Gas Interstate Compact Commission on looking at the safety, and particularly with regard to water contamination, and they have not found a single incident where they can confirm there was any kind of water contamination due to hydraulic fracturing. Any kind of incident with regard to drilling is rare, but there have been incidents where if people haven't handled the produced water at the surface properly, then that would be a problem. I mean, the issue really isn't hydraulic fracturing because you're doing that thousands of feet under the ground where there's non-permeable rock in between you and the aquifer. And you're also using steel casing and cementing it in place. So if you're drilling your vertical well properly, which is just basic practices, there should never be any communication with the water aquifer. But this is a public policy issue in terms that the public is concerned, and our industry clearly needs to do a better job of communicating with stakeholders, both explaining what we're doing, how we're doing it, what are the safeguards, and the more of that communication takes place, I think there'll be less fear about it, because as you pointed out earlier, we've been doing hydraulic fracturing since 1947. 2 million wells have been fractured, and there haven't been any incidents. So, but we have to, our industry has to take the public concerns very seriously and deal with them, or this is one of the things that could bring the shale revolution to a halt.
Yeah. Brian, in your analysis of the resource, I'm sure that was a risk that you evaluated. How did Dow think about that risk, and where did you land on it?
Well, we think that drilling for gas or crude in shale is safe. And we expect the producers of oil and gas to operate safely. I think Marianne has mentioned that sometimes it's more of a public policy issue than it is an actual activity issue. But our analysis has assumed that this is safe and that the population will be kept from problems and that the oil and gas industry will manage this responsibly.
Okay. Andy, any thoughts from the power side?
Yeah, I mean, nothing specific. Obviously, we don't, but we do have, as I said, we have some small financial holdings and some upstream gas businesses. We don't operate them, but absolutely, we mandate all our holdings to comply to the fullest extent of the law and conduct the due diligence that's required. But where I can make a comment on is, remember, we are the largest nuclear operator in this country. So when you think about safety, that is our culture. That is number one in our minds. So we just hope that whole concept, it is a trust you have with the public when you run a nuclear plant, and we take that very, very seriously. So again, from Exelon's perspective, we would just hope that the gas industry does it, and I think they are doing that, and we just keep that so that this trust is built.
Okay, thank you. With that, Rachel, I'll turn it back to you.
So we have some time for discussion and questions. If you wait for me to recognize you, one of my colleagues will come over with the mic. So the floor is yours. Yes, Karen. Just wait for the mic, Karen.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. The supply and demand issue is really a complex one. But I also lived in Houston when the oil boom busted. And there was a famous bumper sticker that said, "Lord, please give us another oil boom, and we promise not to squander it," I think is the way to put it in polite company. But I guess, what are the lessons learned that you can look back in that history and say, we're going to be sure we don't do X or Y?
Interesting question. Well, I think one lesson I think that our company has learned is that you should diversify your portfolio. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Even though we're a large shale gas and oil producer, we also are doing deep water. We're doing Canadian oil sands. We're doing lots of different things. Because what if U.S. gas prices remain so low that, that associated production is going to satisfy demand for a very long time? And it's not then it won't be an attractive investment. So I think that's the biggest learning we have. We also do a lot of scenario planning. We look at our long-range plan over 4 or 5 different scenarios to try to understand how the future could be different, to make sure whatever investment we make is robust. And I think that's another lesson that was learned from the 70s and 80s.
Sure. I would just say that what we've seen in the last decade is still fresh on our minds. And it has been very difficult for us in the United States because of a very tight gas supply that has caused prices to rise, which Andy had mentioned. And it really made us uncompetitive. And And when we think about the balances for natural gas, the size of the whole U.S. market is, I think, about 65 BCF a day. And when we look at the future, we see demand growing by as much as 50% over the next decade. And so far, the producers of the gas have suggested that they can supply that. But supply evolves over time, and it isn't always just what we see today. There's things, unforeseen things that occur, and this is why we think it's a good idea to recognize this as a long-term opportunity and let the supply evolve and let the demand evolve, and before we stimulate too much demand, particularly in the export market, because once that gets set up, generally we're seeing take-or-pay contracts irrespective of the price, and that volume will flow offshore before we really know whether or not our balances can handle it. And so it's just a word of caution that we've had out there to try and get that understanding and let it evolve over time, and then take a step-by-step approach to allowing these opportunities to really develop.
Can I comment also on that? There's been a number of studies done on what the price impact of LNG exports could be on the domestic market. Most of them, if not all but one, they basically said that at most it could cause prices to go up by $1 per million BTU, and still the prices would be below $6. A study done for the Department of Energy, which was the basis of their decision to approve another export terminal, was made based on that study. A number of other studies have said the same thing, and the reason is this flat supply curve. You have all of this gas, the shale gas, that costs under $6. And I have even personally looked at the well economics of, I can't tell you how many, with big data today, you could look at the well economics of every single field that's there and understand what the cost structure is, something we weren't able to do in the past. And it's hard to find anything that costs more than $6 per million BTU anywhere. So the economics look very good, and I think it's a false choice to say we either use the gas here or we export it. I think we could do both. And the truth of the matter is, if we don't have a market for that gas, it won't be produced. So you won't get to have the gas. It will simply be in the ground because it will be uneconomic to produce, which is what's happening today. We are stopped drilling for dry gas today to the extent possible because there isn't a market for it. And when there is a market for it, the nice thing about shale as opposed to deep water is that the response time is much faster because you're drilling onshore. You're drilling lots of wells, but you can drill them very quickly. You don't have as long a permitting time, for example, as you do offshore. You don't have as long a setup and development time. I mean, so the industry response can be faster. You can shift drilling rigs back between oil and gas, which is why we've been able to ramp up oil drilling so quickly. We've just moved the gas rigs over. Now, I think when you're trying to drill for both, we're going to have to build more rigs, but that's easy. And if you see it coming, we all know that this demand, industrial demand, is coming. I think that the industry can gear up for it fairly easily, and we'll look at it as an opportunity.
So let me go back to the audience. I know that there's an awful lot of questions. So, sir, right there.
Right here, behind you.
Oh, right behind you, sir. Got one closer. Oh, okay.
Thank you. The fracking for oil in North Dakota has led to a lot of flaring of natural gas, and it's led to a lot of environmentalists complaining. I even saw Al Gore on TV complaining about it. But it's holding, in addition to that, the Keystone Pipeline decision is being held up mainly for a political compromise or lack of a political compromise. Is it possible, and I'm not sure who in the panel would be best to answer it, possible to build a gas pipeline in the same right-of-way as Keystone and bring the gas, say, to St. Louis and Chicago, and that way you get a big CO2 reduction, and would that lead to a political compromise that you could then move ahead with both Keystone and further fracking?
Well, I can comment just factually, and that is the issue is really not bringing the gas out of the region. The issue is the gathering system from the well. that has to be built. And it's usually being built by a third party whose time to build is something that you can't control. So even the state of North Dakota has a limit on how long one can flare before one has to hook up the gas. So I think that is something that will be reduced over time. Certainly when the gathering systems get built, that will just stop. But I don't think there's an issue further than the gathering systems of getting it to market. The trunk line is not the issue. We have a pretty good long-distance pipeline network in the United States.
So just to elaborate on that, Marianne, the gathering system, it's just a matter of time until they're...
It's just a matter of time to get it, get the pipes from the well to the trunk lines.
Okay, thank you. Yes, right, the woman right here.
This question is related to the price of natural gas. Today we are hovering around the $4 level. You mentioned it could go up to $6. What could be in the horizon of 5 years, let's say 5 to 8 years, what could we expect for price of gas?
Well, we can't talk about prices publicly for antitrust, anti-competitive reasons, but the futures curve in 2017 is at $5, if that helps.
Vance, you can probably comment. Do you want to comment?
If it's any, so our source rock model that I talked about earlier, we see that gas price holding in the $4 to $5 range up to 2020. The wild card in that is the speed in which LNG export can be permitted and built. But that's our working assumption right now.
Great. Yes, all the way in the back there, please.
Just a quick follow-up to Marianne's question regarding production prices and the feasibility of it. Are we pretty much dependent on prices rising, or is there some technological advantage that can get us some economic feasibility out of drilling from shale?
I'm not sure I understand your question. Could you say a little more?
Yeah, so you mentioned that right now it's not economically feasible to drill at the level it's at $4.
For dry gas.
For dry, okay, I'm sorry. So are we dependent on those prices increasing, or is there some technological advantages that are coming along that are out there potentially?
I think the price would have to increase modestly to the $4.55 level to get us drilling for dry gas again.
Yes, sir.
And it would become economic at that price.
Right up here in the front, please.
We talk quite a bit about a petrochemical revolution that we're in the midst of and a power generation revolution. Do you see a transportation revolution driven by cheap gas in the works? Whether it's LNG, CNG, trucking?
Right. Well, I think that heavy-duty trucks are probably the first place you'll see it, because these trucks drive a lot of miles per year, so it pays to spend the upfront capital to convert it to LNG. LNG has about 70% of the density of diesel, so it's better than CNG for a heavy trucking application. The issue, of course, is getting the infrastructure in place, but there's a number of private companies investing in along trucking routes, small liquefaction plants, as well as refueling stations. So I think we are seeing that. It's always there's a big chicken and egg issue, and it's hard to get consumers, even commercial consumers, to switch to new technology. But I think it is happening, but happening very slowly.
David Wolf, right over here, please.
Thank you. I have a quick question on water. Not potable water, but water used in fracking. Enormous amounts of water used in fracking, the issues of production and flow back. How important is that going to be going forward, and is that going to present a constraint in fracking in the future?
I can answer that. You use like 4 to 5 million gallons of water for each well that's fractured. But these wells can last for 20 years, 30 years. So over the life of the well and on a BTU per kilowatt hour basis, it really is a very small use of water. In fact, the amount of water you use for production is small compared to the water used for cooling your nuclear power plants. It looks trivial, and there's been a lot of analysis done on that by the national labs. So I would say that natural gas actually has a very positive water story that most people don't hear about, and that combined cycle power plants use a lot less water for cooling than any kind of a thermal plant, like a coal plant or a nuclear plant. And the amount used in production, even in shale wells, is actually small over the life of the well. It is a problem, though, if you're in a very arid area, like China will have an issue, because if you just don't have the water for that upfront use, then it is an issue.
Brian, we're coming to the end of the time, but I was wondering if you could turn back to manufacturing. Obviously, we're in a part of the country that has really struggled with this, and I think many in this part of the country think that a return to manufacturing means a return to Midwest manufacturing, and we're sitting also right at the center of a lot of these changes. Does it mean that? Does our kind of region right here, will we benefit, or has manufactured in the States moved on, and the effects of manufacturing, while good for the United States, will not necessarily have the kickback here that we might thinking about Dow's investments and how you think about manufacturing? You're probably the right one to answer that.
Sure. Well, I would say that the first step in all of this is kind of the upfront heavier manufacturing that gets evolved. And then the next step is kind of in intermediates, like, let's say, in our industry, ethylene production would be the upfront part. The next step would be polyethylene production, which is more of an intermediate. And then this third step, which is the biggest one when it comes to job creation, is our customers. The customers that buy polyethylene, convert them into products that consumers use. These customers are all over the United States. And if the U.S. has a more competitive source of these raw materials, then what we will see is once they see that our investments are made, then they'll start making their investments, and that's how this whole U.S. manufacturing renaissance really kicks in. So it starts with available supply of gas that's affordable for energy, and then investments in the heavier parts of manufacturing, then the middle part, and then the big job creation machine really comes from the next level, which is our customers. And these customers of ours are all over the United States. We have many right here in Chicago, so we look forward to seeing them invest for growth in the future.
Great, thank you. Vance, I want to turn it over to you to kind of bring us to a close here. Before I kick it over, really, again, on behalf of the Chicago Council, want to thank E.T. Kearney for your support, and particular support of this session today, which, as I think you can tell by the turnout, just tapped a really important kind of topic that we've all been thinking a lot about. So thank you very much on behalf of the council, but let me turn it over to you to close.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. So the themes that I take out of today's session are that, the resource is real, it's scale. There's real concerns around $1 billion of capital investment for downstream use industries relative to how quickly the drilling companies can turn the rigs on and turn them off. Because the worst thing that could happen in Brian's world or Andy's world is making a multi-billion-dollar investment predicated on $5 gas price, and then Marianne's team decides not to drill and gas price goes to $8 again. That would really, really hurt your project economics. So it seems like we require policy. We require some cooperation across that to have a balanced way into the future. I think that would be A.T. Kearney's perspective, and it's been reinforced by what I've heard here today. So with that, thank you so much, and thank you for being such a good audience.